Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party presidential candidate in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that my running mate Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. And today I am in Kyiv, Ukraine, with two brothers from Sotsialny Ruch, or the social movement, and in the other box is Alex Scrivener, who is in Tbilisi, Georgia. And so we're going to talk about what's going on in this part of the world. And I think it's really important for us in the United States to hear directly from people who live here instead of making pronouncements without even talking to these folks. So as people are probably aware, there was a very important election in Tbilisi last Saturday. And so I want to ask Alex to give us a brief report on what happened, what the response has been, and what might happen next. So Alex, how are you doing again? I just saw you when I was there in Georgia. It's good to see you again. So tell us what's going on.
Well, first of all, it's really gratifying to see you in Ukraine on the front line of our common battle, as many Georgians will see it, with the forces of autocracy, and that's something that can definitely bridges the divide. And many people in Georgia, absolutely stand behind Ukraine and the battles of the Ukrainian people as they fight against the far right, effectively, ultra nationalist, murderous regime of Putin. But that's, I think, to bring us on to Georgia. How did we get to a situation where arguably one of the most pro-EU, pro-Ukrainian societies in the world, if you walk around Tbilisi or anywhere in Georgia, you will see lots of pro-Ukraine graffiti, lots of talk to any, Georgian, especially sort of, and under the age of sort of 45, and you'll not hear a bad word said of Ukraine. And Georgia is by far the largest single contributor of volunteers to the Ukrainian war effort. Constantly there's a stream of Georgians dying on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. So there's a long history of solidarity between the Ukrainian and Georgian peoples. So how did we get to a situation where here in an election we have effectively a victory with 54% of the vote of the Georgian Dream Party, which has, I suppose, fought its campaign and spent the last 2 years since the outbreak of the full-scale war against Ukraine, effectively distancing itself from the Ukrainian struggle and effectively turning away from European integration and turning away from the sort of, the traditional Georgian foreign policy orientation of being very close to Kyiv. So how did we get to a position where this ostensibly quite unpopular stance in a country where 80% of people say they want to join the EU, where the vast majority of people say they take the side of Ukraine in the war against Russia? How do we get to this situation where a party that seemingly stands away from both of those two tenets has won? And it's a complex question. But effectively, the first thing to add is these elections have not been assessed by most objective observers and analysts, and especially not by local observers, as being fully free and fair. The OSCE ODIHR observation mission's preliminary assessment, the OSCE is known for being very measured in its and sort of careful in how it phrases its assessments of elections, assessed 24% of polling stations in Georgia to have problems related to secrecy of voting. It suggests that the election took place in an atmosphere that included intimidation, and it was definitely an assessment. And I think the Council of the press conference, where all the different observation organisations from international organisations came together to declare their preliminary assessments, the head of the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's observation mission put it that this was an election that evoked Big Brother. It was an election which Big Brother was watching you, in a sense that when you went to a lot of polling stations, there were cameras that were being run by the ruling party to sort of video the entire polling process at polling stations. There were there was an atmosphere of I would say intimidation and in the election process that a lot of local observers have especially focused on. And there were allegations that things that worse than that have happened in this election. So a lot of the opposition parties and some of the local observer organizations alleged that effectively this election was rigged, in the sense that there was the irregularities in the election were sufficient to potentially have changed the results. So we see that the exit polls run by two of the international polling organizations that were present in Georgia put Georgian Dream's vote at between 40 and 42%, which wouldn't have been enough for them to claim victory. And the final result was 54%. Now, we remember, obviously, polling can be wrong, but both polling organizations have said that, based on their data, it is almost a statistical impossibility for their polling to be wrong to that degree without some element of some element of irregularity. And there are allegations that people multiple voting took place using different ID cards and a number of other things. Now, I can't comment on the evidence there, whether to what extent that might have changed the result, but I can just relay what different organizations, different local observation organizations, what opposition politicians have alleged. And it has culminated in the president of the country, Salome Zurabishvili, effectively declaring that the election was not free and fair. So that's definitely one part of it. Now, obviously, the government, for its part, says that this election was conducted in a fair way. It says that the allegations from the local observation organizations are partisan, but that's its perspective. And there definitely is a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals who are saying rather different things. But that's one side. But also, regardless of the fact that this election, how fair this election was, it's definitely true that the 40% at least of the population, at the very least, supported the government. And it seems difficult to square that with the polling data that shows that 80% of people support the EU and large majority of the people support Ukraine. And the answer to that question is fear of a Russian intervention. The ruling party's campaign juxtaposed images of ruined Ukrainian buildings, the ruined Ukrainian churches, with there are Georgian equivalents that are in rather better repair, and said, look, basically saying to the Georgian people, either you vote for us or we'll end up like Ukraine. And there's a sort of we're a much smaller country here than Ukraine is. We had a war with Russia in 2008. We lasted about 5 days. Unlike Ukraine, there isn't a realistic prospect that we'd be able to withstand a full-scale Russian invasion. So in the minds of some people in Georgia, there is this idea that, yes, we would love to be part of the European Union. Yes, we want Ukraine to win the war against Russia. But if we don't kowtow to the Russians, they will just crush us, and we will end up in a war that we have, unlike Ukraine, absolutely no chance of winning. Now, it's not a perspective that I necessarily agree with, because I don't think that Russia would necessarily have the ability to launch a full-scale invasion and a second front against Georgia right now. But it is a fear that definitely plays well, especially to older and more conservative voters. And obviously, there's also the kind of classic pro-Russia homophobia, which I think across Europe we are seeing used by the Russian regime to kind of cast Europe as being this sort of LGBT plus threat, which under very socially conservative voters, while it might not turn them openly pro-Russian, at least turns them against European integration. And unfortunately, homophobia is a very powerful weapon in the hands of reactionaries and the far right across the region. And the Orthodox Church plays its own part in that socially. So sorry, that's a rather long answer, but effectively, we do see a situation here where while the majority of people in Georgia stand absolutely with their Ukrainian brothers and sisters, we have more people, as I said, of any foreign country, any non-Ukrainian country fighting with Ukrainians. We have this absurd situation where we have a government that is actually taking rather anti-Ukrainian stances, and a government that has, whether they won fairly or not, a significant proportion of the population willing to at least grudgingly support it.
So what do you think might happen in terms of resistance? There was a big demonstration on Monday. And then, what I was getting from people I talked to the rest of the week is everybody's kind of waiting for the opposition parties to announce plans, and they don't have great trust in each other, so they're not coordinating very effectively. And then the other part of the equation was there was a mass movement against the foreign agents registration law in the spring that came out. So give us a little, projection of what we can look for and what we in the United States should be thinking about in terms of solidarity.
Yeah. So in terms of the protest question, yes, there was a protest on Monday, but actually, contrary to expectations, it's been rather quiet since then, because opposition parties have chosen to collect evidence and to sort of appeal to international interlocutors over boosting the domestic protests and calling domestic protests, which some people say is a mistake. But I think from their perspective, the government has been messaging for quite a long time that they fear a Maidan in Georgia, and they have been prepared for mass protests in Georgia in response to these elections. So there's an extent to which I think people here are worried about sort of conforming to the stereotype that the government has sort of set. Having said that, is going to be another protest here on Monday, and that might begin a more beginning of a new wave of kind of protest against this election result. But overwhelming, the sort of feeling on the ground at sort of gut level here in Georgia is one of just depression and sort of if you're walking in the streets and sort of talking to younger people, especially in this country, it doesn't feel there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of sort of depression and shock actually at what has happened. And especially, I mean, I think talking to most people here, there are very few people who seem to think that the election was fair. But at the same time, there's sort of feeling of despair that, whatever they do, whether they protest or not, there's very little they can do. Now, obviously, it remains to be seen whether that's true. And, we're right at the beginning of this process. The results haven't even been officially certified yet. And, we'll see what happens at the protest on Monday. But there is a sort of feeling of sort of, I guess I can't really put it any other way. A sort of despair amongst some people who support the opposition here, and even amongst those who support the government, there's not a particular feeling of jubilation either. It's a very subdued, sort of depressed feeling on the ground here. So it's very hard to predict what will happen. I mean, it's very difficult. But the opposition is saying that they won't recognise the election results. But it's very difficult to see what leverage they have against the government that has all the cards in its hands effectively, and the power of the state. So it remains to be seen. I think more information will hopefully come out about the election, and the international organizations will publish their final reports. We'll see what that comes up with, but it's going to be, it's very hard to predict what will happen. It could be anything at all could happen. And that's for solidarity from the West. I mean, some would be quite nice. I mean, I think our Ukrainian friends would definitely, on the left, feel, I think a very similar thing, that it's been a real uphill struggle to get some of our Western comrades to take us seriously and to hear our voices from this region, and it's sort of drowned out by the loudest, more let's put it, campist, I guess, voices on the Western left are far louder than the ones that are preaching solidarity for Ukraine and by extension for Georgia and Moldova and the other countries in the region fighting Russian imperialism. So, I mean, the bar is not particularly high, unfortunately, in terms of solidarity for Georgia and even for Ukraine. So, any voice that can kind of not drown out, but at least compete with the voices of those in the West who preach the Russian line, would be incredibly helpful, not just in terms of the fight against Russia, but also the domestic battles here in terms of strengthening what is still a very weak left progressive movement in Georgia, and I think in many other countries in the region. It's weak because the feeling on the ground here is the left isn't on our side. When an ordinary person who isn't necessarily very politicized listens to what the left in the West has to say, the loudest voices are the ones saying, Russia is defending itself against NATO encroachment, and therefore it was justified that they're murdering thousands of men, women, and children in Ukraine. So I mean, those are the loudest voices that people are hearing from the left. It's no wonder that our leftist movements and our progressive movements in our country are as weak as they are. We need to hear louder voices from progressive voices in the West that support the struggle of the Ukrainian people and the Georgian people and the rest of the peoples of this region who are fighting Russian imperialism, including those fighting Russian imperialism within Russia, so the peoples of North Caucasus and so forth.
Okay, Alex, thank you. Let's turn to Ukraine now, and saw a comment there. We'll get to the comments in a minute. So I'm here with Denis Pilash and Pavlo Bryzhatia, left and center. Let's see on the screen, it's right and center. And why don't you guys talk about, I just came in and I walked into a meeting where you guys are meeting with members of the European Parliament from left parties from Finland to Portugal.
Yes.
And right there in the office of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is the foundation of Die Linke. There was a new co-chair of Die Linke. The Tankies left. Die Linke is the left in Germany. So why don't you tell us about that discussion and what it means? Because you guys, I think, are practicing internationalism. To an extent, the rest of us should take as a good example. So tell us, what's going on with that meeting and just generally what you want people to know about what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, okay, I can start. Well, at first I'll present myself to you viewers. My name is Pavlo Bryzhatia. I am a student, member of Socialny Ruch's Council, our main political body, and also a trade unionist at heart. I'm a member of the student trade union called Dia, Direct Action. And I was elected to the council this year, a few months ago, actually, and I'm in charge of international politics. And this came at a time for me when I realized that I've been having this realization. So from the times when I popularly joined the left-wing movement in Ukraine in the summer of 2022, that Socialny Ruch had one of the greatest use diplomatic efforts to unite the left behind the solidarity for Ukraine, because we started facing the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we had to basically think on the spot how to unite people from very varying perspectives into the left. And I remember when I attended the first organization conference, for me, we were met with delegates from France, from Italy, and also from Poland. For instance, one of the members of the Polish Parliament, the same Maciej Konieczny, gave us a speech, an introductory speech, and I was really amazed that we have created such an influence on the European left that we were still able to keep the topic of Ukraine even to this day, thanks to those efforts that we put ourselves into, that we invest a lot in continuous struggles for solidarity with Ukraine. And today's meeting was no exception, because today we met with delegates from five countries, for five left parties, and the main part of the delegation was, at first it was Lea Andersson. She's a current member of the European Parliament from the Left Alliance of Finland. She was also a former member of Finnish Parliament and also a former education minister of Finland, which is quite important given the specifics of reforms in education in Ukraine. Then it was Jan Paul van Aken, who was recently elected as the co-chair of the Die Linke in Germany, and he was once a member of Bundestag. And then there was also Katarina Martins. She's now a member of the European Parliament from the Left Bloc of Portugal. She was also co-leader of the Left Bloc for some time and a member of the National Parliament. She even ran for president for some time ago in Portugal. Then there was Jonas Sjöstedt. He is a member of the European Parliament from the Left Party of Sweden, also a former leader of the party and former member of Swedish Parliament. And then there was Friederike Hellemann. She is an assistant to the current member of the European Parliament from the Red Green Alliance Party from Denmark. The MEP's name is Per Clausen, and she's also working in the left group faction in the European Parliament, and she is mostly specialized in environmental politics. And why all of it is important is because those parties that I've mentioned, particularly the Left Bloc, the Portuguese Left Bloc, the Finnish Left Alliance, the Swedish Left Party, and the Danish Red Green Alliance, those parties are one of the most fervent supporters of Ukraine in whatever way possible, particularly with armed support. They might have discussions about it, yes, but they are persistent in expressing solidarity with Ukraine. And this even goes beyond that in the way that they're trying to make Russia pay its due for all its war crimes that it's committed in Ukraine. In particular, they are actively pushing, particularly the Left Party of Sweden and the Left Alliance of Finland. They're actively pushing Russia's shadow fleet that is delivering Russian oil in the Baltic Sea of the sea. They want to have it removed, and they don't want it to spread they don't want it to be present at all in the Baltic Sea, illegally trading Russian oil. And they're also active in stopping Russia's liquefied natural gas that is being exported through Azerbaijan, that has become a really good ally of Russia. And this meeting with them helped us facilitate this solidarity. And this happened during the time in the morning, when we had several air alarms declared in Kyiv, and there were audible anti-air defenses works in a district not far away from where we were meeting. And particularly, there were Iranian drones, Shaheds, flying over, so they were able to. So I think they might have heard them on the way. I don't know,
Of course.
Yeah, they must have. So. And this helped them realize that we are a country facing war, that they cannot, that they already don't ignore the issues of Ukrainians and the issues that we raise as the Ukrainian left to them. So for me, it feels like that this will even help our solidify our cause, because without consistent resistance to the Russian imperialism in whatever way we can, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, there will be no socialist Europe. There will be no socialist Europe that lots of European left is dreaming of. And that's why we need to fight Russian imperialism as much as possible. That's one of the main set points that we make this, particularly because we might have conflicting opinions on joining the European Union, but we already have allies in the European Parliament who will be at least able to somewhat scrutinize the Ukraine's neoliberal government that is actively pushing reforms that might even contradict European legislation, particularly in labor law. And that's why we are actively mentioning this about those labor laws changing, and the way that those aren't really equipped for the country that has a really strong specific background as being the post-Soviet country that has a remnants of the social state being left in it, like our ally, like in countries, most countries from Central Eastern Europe, whom we are actively cooperating with through the alliance called CEGLA, Central Eastern European Green Left Alliance. Which is a collection of parties and political organizations from Central Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, Lithuania, Czechia, Poland, Hungary, and Romania. And because of this effective cooperation with them, we are able to keep our policy, keep our agenda, at least on the topic of the European left. And I would really like to extend those. We really be glad to welcome our fellow comrades from Georgia, from Sakartvelo, who share lots of the same struggles. Yes, and who share the same state of some. When we remember the times when our Donbas war was a frozen conflict, when we were unable to find easy solutions to it. And we should extend the solidarity to those people who face frozen conflict now in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So, yeah, on that note, I'll end. I'll let Denis take over.
Yep. So I just maybe couple of thoughts. So this visit of this European delegation with leftist members of European Parliament being present in it, so it's a manifestation of another tendency in global left movement that people on socialist, ecologist, anarchist left who essentially are quite consistent in their internationalism, that you need to be in solidarity with the oppressed, solidarity with victims of imperial aggressions, victims of structural discrimination and exploitation, notwithstanding what sort of imperialism is oppressing them, be it Ukrainians against Russian imperialism, or Palestinians against the Israeli occupation, or the Kurdish people against Turkish government, or the people of Myanmar against their dictatorial regime. So across the world, you have lots of manifestations of injustice and imperial exploitation of smaller peoples and smaller countries. And ultimately, to be consistent in your internationalism, you must stand up against any oppressor and any imperialist, be it a Western one or a non-Western one. Those who try to present themselves as some sort of alternative. But ultimately, I do think that what Putin is doing with in the post-Soviet space is not some sort of antithesis to the Western imperialist aggressions like the invasion of Iraq, but it's a continuation. It's the same process of actually strong, great powers using unilateral, aggressive invasions to promote their agenda and to try to impose their control over entire regions, but ultimately causing humanitarian disasters that will last for enormous time and disrupt enormous number of human lives. So yes, this is one wing, one camp inside the leftist movement, but you have a whole spectrum. And as it was mentioned, often you also meet some other approaches that actually they are based on lots of ignorance about the history of say Russian imperialism and those peoples of Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia that have been subject to Russian expansionism and being oppressed under the Tsarist Empire or under Stalinist dictatorship, and now under the new far-right authoritarian regime of Putin in Russia. And again, like Putin's Russia is sort of a beacon for reactionaries all throughout the world. From Jair Bolsonaro to Narendra Modi, it was empowering other authoritarians, other right-wing populists, other ultra-conservatives that are actually defying everything we stand for, all the ideas of freedom, equality, self-governance, and solidarity between peoples. And what's quite dangerous. Like we heard what's going on in Georgia, and oligarch Ivanishvili's ruling party's Georgian Dream is essentially using the same playbooks that Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party used in Hungary. It's also stirring up this social conservative hysteria. It's trying to manipulate people with fears of war, yes, presenting themselves as someone who present alternative to being invaded, and essentially like dropping Ukrainian solidarity out of picture. And also it's pretty the same legislation with all this criminalization of so-called LGBT propaganda, other conservative laws, and of course the law against the so-called foreign agents. So this was present in not just in Hungary and Georgia. This is something that is in many places copy-pasted from the Russian example. And then you have another player in this picture that's connected. Everything is interconnected here. And this is Western far right, because neo-fascists and other far right, extreme right movements and persons in Europe and North America, they also look up to Russian example. And what we see here, and what almost every Ukrainian is now afraid, is the prospect of far-right candidates winning over, say, the US in the upcoming elections, or many European countries. Because we see that the most reactionary circles of Western ruling classes, most of them agree in throwing Ukraine under the bus, and channeling the support for Ukraine instead for Netanyahu's government in Israel, for instance, yes, for its special military operation, yes, to use Putinist language, against Palestine and now southern Lebanon. So essentially, we have already seen what this delay or stopping the US military assistance means, when the Republican Party has blocked military aid for Ukraine, and it doesn't lead to so-called peace and so-called negotiations. It instead led to more deaths on Ukrainian side, including more civilian deaths, because this includes things that are quite essential for us, even being here and having this conversation. Without air defense, Ukrainian cities would be razed to the ground, like many places in eastern Ukraine have been, by the Russian army, from Mariupol to smaller towns and cities like Kurachovo or Rubizhne. So there is a complete disaster there. So and at the same time, what we were having all these conversations with those leftist politicians coming from mostly Nordic and also the Portuguese left blocs, that all these parties, they agree on a very much anti-capitalist, democratic socialist, eco-socialist, feminist agenda. We share as well here in Ukraine. We were also speaking about other obstacles towards prevailing of Ukrainian people in its resistance to Russian aggression. And this, of course, includes the problem inside the Ukrainian ruling class itself. This includes those, it was already mentioned, anti-social, anti-labor moves that were taken by our own neoliberal government, that only disrupt, only the Ukrainian war effort. And ultimately, not enough efforts were put to create a proper war economy, because it would involve challenging the omnipotence of Ukrainian capitalist, oligarchic capitalist class. Yes, it would engage more public sector in economy. It would involve more state intervention in economy. It would involve more attention paid to not just to the arms and army sector, but also to such essential things as, for instance, physical and mental health, expanding the system of healthcare institutions, and so on and so on, or preserving the Ukrainian scientific and technological resources that were very essential to for the mere ability of Ukraine to strike back. Because if you recall, this major Russian cruiser called Moskva, it was sunk by Ukrainian missiles developed by Ukrainian scientists in Ukrainian institutes. And now, for instance, our Ministry of Science and Education, it's doing very harsh neoliberal reforms that essentially subdue the ability to produce normal education for all, and also all these scientific innovations as well. Yeah, so there is lots of challenges put like for the Ukrainian left in general, and for our organization as a political group that strives to build a grassroots leftist party for working classes. And they involve resisting Russian imperialism as well as any other imperialism. And this includes also resisting the vicious circle of debt and those conditionalities that can be put on Ukraine by the so-called donors from International Monetary Fund and similar institutions. But it also includes continuing of social struggles inside Ukraine to preserve that those Ukrainian working people, men and women who keep the country alive, both on front line and behind it, working, being essential workers. And mostly these are working class people, both in the army and in all these sectors, that keep the country floating and that keep the existence and survival of millions and millions of people inside the country, that their interest will be put as priorities in wartime and post-war reconstruction, and that like these big business vested interests, they would be challenged by the organized forces of working classes. Yes, so this is something where we also need a very consistent international solidarity, because essentially all imperialisms and capitalist system and as a whole is a very common threat and challenge for all of us.
Yeah, well, the war is real, and I think in America we're so isolated that we get some pretty inane statements about how, oh, if the U.S. just stopped arming Ukraine and negotiated, the war would end. And while we've been sitting here, there have been 2 air alerts. I don't know if you can see it. I got the app now. You know, I don't know, you can see the 2 things, and they had them this morning. You know, we don't get those in the United States. There are hundreds of attacks on the front line from Russia. And we got people on the so-called left in the United States saying, oh, don't disarm Ukraine and go negotiate with Putin. And as Dennis just pointed out, when the U.S. did not supply arms for 6 months, Putin escalated. And this week in the United Nations, their ambassador said, we don't want another Minsk agreement. We want what they said they wanted at the beginning: denazification, which means a new government that's their puppet, and demilitarization, which means Ukraine can't defend itself. And I wrote an article about this. There was at one point, Russia said, we're doing to Ukraine what Israel is doing to Gaza. It looks like when Netanyahu says we're going to destroy Hamas, that's denazification. And when Netanyahu says they're going to destroy the Hamas military, that's demilitarization. And, you know, a lot of people in the United States think Russia is some kind of anti-imperialist force because it's in conflict with U.S. imperialism. But you know what? You can have an inter-imperialist conflict, and the imperialists on both sides. And that's what I think a lot of us miss in the United States. And case in point, you know, when I walked into this meeting today, there was a guy from Sweden, and I'm a butcher his last name. His first name's Jonas, and he pronounced that
Hjöstedt.
Yeah.
Kostedt. I'm a quarter
Good enough.
Swedish, I can't say it, but he was at a meeting I was in. I was running for governor the first time in New York, and it was a meeting the Socialist Party hosted in solidarity, because I was a Green Party candidate, at the Warrior Resisters League office. And I didn't remember that he was at the meeting, but as we talked, I remember him being there. And now he's a member of parliament from the Swedish, what's it called? Just the left
Party.
the left party in Sweden. And, you know, he's here in solidarity with Ukraine. And what a lot of the people on the so-called left in the US don't understand, when the left meets here in Europe, like they were here in Kyiv, they talk about how can we best support the Ukrainians against this imperialist aggression by Russia. And they admitted they have some debates within their parties about how to arm, to what extent to arm Ukraine, but they also talk about, well, what are the diplomatic means as well? And they are talking about negotiate after you disarm one side and tell the other side, now we're ready to negotiate. That's crazy. But that's what, well, I'll get to it in a minute, but that's what our presidential candidate just said, Jill Stein. But they were talking about, okay, what about the sanctions against this petrostate, Russia? It's leaking like a sieve. The gas and the oil is getting out. And particularly for the Greens who want to stop oil and gas from being, you know, drilled, exported, and burned and heating up the planet, that should be something that we emphasize. So that's what the left in Europe talks about. And unfortunately, we're not having that conversation in the United States. Now, in terms of international solidarity, many of you are aware that a number of European Green parties sent a letter to the American Green Party asking Jill Stein to step down and endorse Harris, the Democratic candidate. And the Americans wrote back. And I think that's a debate we should be having, not 4 days before the election. It should have been a discussion between the American Greens and the European Greens all along. Because you know, from the American side, I don't think the European Greens appreciate how reactionary the Democratic Party is on climate change and so forth. In terms of imperialism, what they're doing in Gaza is unconscionable. The U.S. are full partners with Netanyahu in genocide. So, and they want us to support that. I think they really don't have an appreciation for how bad the Democrats are. On the other side, of course, Trump is even worse. But in the response, I thought some of the points the Americans made, but when it got to Ukraine, you know, it was the same trope that the U.S., you know, started it. And, you know, it's a proxy war, as if people in Ukraine have to be told to fight to defend themselves. So I think, you know, those of us in the Green Party movement in the United States, we need to have that discussion about what our policy should be in solidarity, anti-imperialist against Russian as well as U.S. imperialism, and make the connections. That's what I really appreciate about people in Ukraine and people in Georgia. They want to make those connections. One of the things I did in Georgia was talk to people that massive struggle against a dam that would drown 18 villages. This is in a part of the world where winemaking was invented 8,000 years ago. They have grape varieties adapted to microclimates, kind of like American Indians developed corn. And that heritage would be wiped out. That's part of their struggle. And it's a popular struggle across Georgia. It's a real community-based environmental struggle. And the campus say, you know, the Georgia Dream say, oh, it's Western NGOs, you know, drumming this up, outside agitators. Like the Dixiecrats used to say that Black people were fighting for their civil rights in the South because the communists made them do it. I mean, that's how absurd this gets. The real funding of that movement are migrant workers in Canada who send back $10 a week to support the movement. You know, they're like people from this part of the world go to Western Europe, just like people in Mexico and Latin America go to the United States to work and send back remittances to support their family. So I just wanted to bring that up because I'm sure many of you are aware that exchange of letters right before the election. And, you know, my main point is, besides criticism of the position that was put out on Ukraine, is that, I think the Europeans are to blame as much as we are in the West, in America, is that why the hell aren't we talking to each other instead of putting these missives out at the last minute? So that is, I guess, a report from, you know, 3 different countries and a lot of Europe. And I know some people have comments and questions they put, so we still got 15 minutes. So why don't we address those? So Seth Baker, it sucks. The camp tanky people are controlling the narrative online in America. Jill and Butch, those are the Green Party presidential ticket, have shameful views on it. Yeah, it's really embarrassing for me when I come in and watch these lefties in Europe debating how to support Ukraine, and the American Green Party, that's the left party in the United States, doesn't even understand what's going on in Ukraine. So it's shameful. To me, it's just more embarrassing. We got to do better. But you guys have a comment, or Alex?
Yeah, I mean, you and I had a conversation about this when you were here in Tbilisi, Howie. And obviously the whole point of having a Green candidate for president is to allow people to vote with their consciences. Now, when that candidate is Jill Stein, and effectively that person supports the destruction of our nations and our subjugation to the Russian Empire implicitly, it's that is not there's not progress as far as we're concerned. I mean, I've said to you there, if I were in the US, I would not be able to, in good conscience, vote for that kind of ticket. And I know, Howie, you represent a very different kind of politics. And you know, it's very difficult. You know, and it's kind of heartbreaking for those of us on the progressive side of the spectrum in the region to see people who should be on our side actually taking the side of our enemies. And it's something that has to change, or else, you know, we're all going to be paying the price for it in terms of the effectiveness of the progressive movement and the green movement across the world.
May I take
Yeah.
over just a sec? Well, it is really sad that all of our efforts that we are trying to go through in Sozialny Ruch by trying to pursue American socialists, American leftists, of the necessity to fight Russian imperialism, and sometimes it feels like it hits a brick wall that I would personally call American exceptionalism in a weird way,
Yeah.
because there is oftentimes the idea of American exceptionalism as something that as an America being the best nation in the world, and therefore we must manifest destiny.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it feels like that the American left wing has the opposite. It has the American anti-exceptionalism, in a way that they think that America is the worst nation in the world. Therefore, we must unmanifest our destiny by dismantling everything related to the United States, even maybe to some radicals, even the United States itself. And this also poisons the entire left wing in the United States, where they're only blinded by, they only see America. They only see its imperialism, but not the imperialisms of other states, particularly Russia. And I don't know how we can overcome this anti-exceptionalism present in the left, but feel that this will be a long-standing issue for the years to come, to overcome this barrier of acceptability of other imperialisms.
Yeah, so trying to whitewash such oppressive regimes as Assad's in Syria, or trying to whitewash, even worse, like big imperial, essentially fossil fuel empires. Yes, in this regard, Russia is no better than Saudi Arabia, but vice versa as well. Yeah, so this is something that definitely people on the left, and especially on the green left, they shouldn't do. Yes, it goes against all principles and values. Yes, this is something that is on the opposite side of the spectrum.
So let's see what the next question or comment is.
Yeah.
Iridescent dragonfly, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
iridescent dragonfly.
So you like U.S. NATO imperialism better? Well, no is my short answer. I'll let the guest elaborate.
All imperialisms are, or every imperialism is bad, and this is something that I guess people who have read something from Marxist theory of early 20th century, all different positions, like from Lenin, Bukharin, or Rosa Luxemburg to Kautsky and Guilfording and John Hobson and everyone who wrote about imperialism at that stage. Yes, different imperialisms, they may compete with each other. Yes, but this is not a prerequisite for essentially trying to whitewash and to promote like one as if it was some sort of anti-imperialist. Yes, so essentially the revolutionaries all throughout the Russian Empire, especially in the those parts of the empires that were like oppressed nations, they were quite clear about the nature of Russian Empire that was already in the 19th century presenting itself as like the gendarme of Europe, like by suppressing popular movements and revolutions like Hungarian one in 1848-49. And now you see that modern Putin's Russia, it's doing the same. It's trying to be this safeguard of every conservative and authoritarian regime in its sphere of influence. So prior to invading Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, yes, they helped to suppress the popular unrest in Kazakhstan. Prior to that, they helped to suppress protest movement in Belarus. Yes, now they are doing this sort of crippling return to control Georgia and its economy and political system. So ultimately, for the peoples of post-Soviet space, like this Russian regime that proclaims that each and every popular movement, they have no agency of their own. It has to be a puppet of some foreign other great power. But because people aren't in the minds of these conservatives, both Eastern and Western, people don't have the ability to self-organize. They have to be somehow stirred up by your competing force. Yes, so this is something that is just denying the power of people. So we need to show them that essentially the people united can counter any authority and any imperialist.
Yeah, may I answer somewhat, or would you like?
Well, I was going to ask Alex if you wanted to add.
Oh, okay.
I'll let you add first if you like, and then I'll finish if you.
Okay. Well, yeah, and usually we see NATO as basically an antithesis to Russia, and it's something that really isn't looked at the West, where it's basically a question of survival. It's the simplest lens that is understood by most Ukrainians who are not into politics that much, and somewhat by us as well. Like, for instance, the Left Alliance of Finland, if not mistaken, they voted to actively join NATO.
No, they were divided. Half of them voted, half voted. So it's not an issue.
Yeah, but still, it was an issue because it mostly relied on the question of survival. Because Finland wasn't a member of NATO up until 2023. Or 2022.
And effectively, Putin was the best salesman for NATO.
Yes,
because due to his invasion of Ukraine, Sweden and Finland went into the alliance as well. So, and again, Russia uses all this. Russia uses the same narratives that Reagan administration did towards Latin American states. Yes, we have security concerns at our borders, so we have to invade Grenada, or we have to support these murderous dictatorships in Central America. The same is done by modern Russia.
So, Alex?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would like to underline exactly what you just said. Like, I think it's very comfortable, privileged position to sit in the US and to preach to people in Ukraine and Georgia and these countries that, oh, you shouldn't join NATO because, you know, it's an imperialist alliance, blah, blah, blah. This is a matter of life or death. Now, let's look at the countries that border Russia, right, to the west and to the south. Of these countries, which of them have been invaded recently, which not? For some reason, Russia hasn't invaded Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. I wonder why. And has invaded Georgia and Ukraine, and has troops in Moldova. And the reason is the three last countries I mentioned are not members of NATO. NATO did not expect, the kind of Jill Stein view of this is that NATO is some kind of expanded to reach Russia, as if NATO invaded Poland and the Baltic states and made these countries join NATO against their will. These countries begged to join NATO because it was the only way that they could stop Russian imperialism, Russian tanks rolling into their country. These countries have spent hundreds of years resisting Russian imperialism. And finally, in the form of NATO, there is a pragmatic way they can stop Russians from coming in and invading their countries. And they take it, and it's really privileged of Western leftists to sort of pretend that this isn't a factor. You know, if we all know that Russia isn't going to be invading France or the US anytime soon. If that was the case, I'm pretty sure people would have a different stance. Now, that's why I like to divorce the question of US and NATO imperialism here, because obviously I'm of the generation who were radicalized to the left by the US invasion of Iraq, and you know the previous generations have seen other conflicts of that sort. And obviously Russian imperialism is bad. Obviously, you know, US military interventions into countries that are, you know, like that. I mean, obviously we've seen a lot of damage for that. And obviously those things are terrible things. And I was on the streets back as a student and as a school kid, actually, back in 2003 and 4, protesting the invasion of Iraq. But let's not lose sight of that's different. NATO is a different beast here. Now, if you think, I often put it this way: if you could imagine a kind of socialist, progressive Europe, you know, what kind of defense alliance would you put together? You would put together one that's based on sort of that core leftist and progressive value, and that's the value of solidarity between countries. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is the base principle behind the NATO alliance. Is an attack on one country is an attack on all. It's actually that the Article 5 of NATO, I'm not defending everything NATO does in practice, but the core principle behind it is that the attack on the smallest country, the most defenseless country, is equated to an attack against the United States and the strongest country. And that is a principle of solidarity that actually isn't antithetical to what progressives stand for. And actually, as we can see, the evidence of the fact we don't see a Russian invasion of Poland right now or Estonia, it actually works in practice to stop imperialist encroachment into these countries. So yes, obviously, you know, NATO has not always had a positive role in everything. There are a lot of things to complain about in terms of NATO, what NATO has done and how it's worked in practice, you know, but in terms of a principle, let's forget the word NATO for a moment. The idea that countries should stand in solidarity with one another and guarantee each other against external aggression is a principle I don't think is against what progressives stand for. So I would like to kind of split the kind of idea of a military alliance as defensive in nature from an offensive imperialism, which obviously we all have to oppose. And obviously there's the pragmatic, as you know, as my Ukrainian friends have just said, if you are sitting in Ukraine and you're being bombed by the Russians, the proclamations of people sitting in the West saying, "Oh, why don't you just not join NATO and not get any support from anyone else and sort of fight the Russians with your bare hands," just is laughable. And I think people who say that sort of thing need to think about what it's really like to be on the front line against Russian imperialism.
Yeah, and can I just elaborate? I wanted to point out a little important historical fact to understanding Central Eastern Europe's willingness to join NATO, and that's two great examples. That's the revolution of 1956 in Hungary and the Prague Spring of 1968 in Czechoslovakia then. And those were really the center points of when possibly in Hungary it was a bit controversial about the protest, about what they were about the main point of the protest, whereas the Prague Spring for me personally was the manifestation of some sort of at least an attempt to establish proper democratic socialism, because one of the main slogans of the Prague Spring was socialism with a human face, socialism s lidskou tváří. And this was crushed by the Soviet Russia. They entered. They basically moved their forces into Czechoslovakia, basically occupying it for at least 20 years up until the dissolution of up until the processes of the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. And I remember while I was studying Czech language, I watched the film called Pilash. I forgot how it's translated in English, but maybe you'll find out later. It was about some collection of personal stories of the people from those from 1968 when when all the economic hardships, all the difficult political processes compiled on each other, and then the Soviet army entered, basically started its presence in Czechoslovakia. And that's one of the really important center points in Czech history. And then when the Russian army left, they felt relieved, and they didn't really want that occupation to repeat again. So that's why Czechia joined NATO, like in the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s, if not mistaken.
1990s.
Yeah, that's really important historic point to this. And Hungary might,
the same year.
Yeah, the same year. Yeah, it was the same expansion title. So it's really important to understand all the difficult history of Central Eastern Europe with Russia, so that you could understand our willingness for NATO here.
At war with us, do you all see a parallel between the fight against Franco in the 30s and against Putin today? Seems more leftists should set their moral compass by that disgraceful failure to offer aid to Spain. I'll just say briefly, yeah, the left didn't have a problem fighting fascists, with arms back in the 30s. Today, there seems to be, I think it's a legacy of the Vietnam War, the kind of a pacifist thing, that the U.S. was the source of all wars, all imperialism, and therefore you really don't have to look at what's going on. Whatever the U.S. is doing, we do the opposite. And the pacifist position that, you can never use arms to defend yourself. I think, what's his name? George Orwell said in the context of World War II, these pacifists are objectively fascist. So I do see a parallel, and I think it's a good point you bring up at war with us. Anybody else?
Yeah,
So I guess it was Howard Zinn's like this: you can't be neutral on a moving train. And there is a saying by, I think, Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, who opposed apartheid, that if in a situation of injustice you claim to be neutral, you are essentially on the side of the oppressor. So this parallel with the Spanish Civil War and the fight against Franco's fascistoid forces, it has been long brought up by our friends from Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in the UK. Yes, so they see this parallel, and they see also another menacing parallel, that if the aggressor states, they are rewarded for the aggressions, just like fascist Italy, Nazi Germany were went off with their support for Franco's mutiny and establishment of another far-right regime in Europe, or with the invasion of Ethiopia, or with dismantling of Czechoslovakia. So this was the road to a much worse disaster for the entire humanity. So you can't appease the aggressor, you can't just fed him like smaller and weaker nations and then await that everything will be fine. No, you are essentially fueling another very menacing conflict that can be even much worse.
Yeah, I agree completely with what you've said. And yes, for a long time, the parallel has not been lost on many of us on the kind of pro-Ukraine side of the progressive world. And I think I've often sort of thought about the war in Ukraine as being a sort of Eastern European holy war in a way. You know, you see like quite a lot of parallel to sort of, you know, like the brigades in Spain, lots of people from different countries coming to fight in Ukraine for Ukraine. But these people are disproportionately from other countries that are victims of Russian imperialism. As I've said before, Georgia is a tiny country, but we have thousands of Georgians fighting in Ukraine for Ukraine, but actually for Georgia as well, because this feels like, I think, all of the countries that are victims of Russian oppression. This is not just Ukraine's war. It's a war for our freedom and a war against the forces of Russian imperialism. So there's absolutely this sort of feeling of solidarity between the peoples in this region. But unlike in the 30s, where it was seen as a war of solidarity, where the left felt like it had to defend by force of arms against the forces of fascism, there is not really anywhere near as much solidarity coming from the left, even rhetorically, never mind in terms of people volunteering. I would love to see a sort of modern day left brigades sort of set up going into Ukraine. Maybe there are some people. I did see there was a group of anarchists actually early on in the war who did come to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine, and that's very good. But these people, obviously, at scale, this has not really happened in the same way as it did in the 30s. But yes, I agree with the point. I wanted to say one other thing. Actually, I just have one eye on the comments at the same time. I did see one of the comments back to the previous point about NATO expansion. Someone saying George Bush pushed for Ukraine and Georgia's NATO membership in 2008. I'd like to correct that. Actually, George Bush might have vaguely supported it, but the people who were pushing for Ukraine and Georgia's NATO membership in 2008 were Ukraine and Georgia's governments. And this kind of idea where our agency as countries is taken away is one of the worst, sort of tendencies in the Western progressive world. You know, we are sort of seen as pawns. We don't have our own ideas. We're not allowed to have our own political decisions. We're not allowed to decide whether we want to join NATO or not, whether we want to join the EU or not. It's always foreign countries pushing for us to join. No. In 2008, Georgia held a referendum on NATO membership. It was overwhelmingly by 70-80% approved by the Georgian people. That is why Georgia wanted to join NATO. And you know, Ukraine at that point was actually much more divided on NATO. It was about 50-50 in this period of time. But now I think it's a very different situation. Russia's invasion, as our Ukrainian friends have said, have convinced many people who were against NATO before that there is no choice. It's a matter of survival. So I would just ask everyone here to stop saying that the West is pushing for us to join particular organizations. Maybe some Western countries support NATO membership. Most of them don't. Most of them would love us not to be in NATO. There's a reason that Georgia and Ukraine did not get to join NATO in 2008. It's because the French and the Germans and a bunch of other Western nations were desperate for us not to join. And that, in fact, if we had joined in 2008, we would not be sitting here now. We probably would not have had a war in Ukraine. So, you know, I think it's very important that we get this right. The Georgians and the Ukrainians have their own agency. We get to decide what we want to do, not America, not Russia. We're not pawns on your chessboard. We're real people. So I just wanted to say that to finish.
Okay, so I guess our hour is up and more. And I really appreciate people coming on. There are questions in the chat. ZOMG Ruler, Zong Ruler. So you had a lot of questions. I know you asked about two things. One thing I want to answer briefly if Jill Stein gets the 5%, you asked how likely it is. I think the polls show it's very unlikely. 5% is significant because then the Greens would qualify for a public campaign grant for the next presidential campaign. It'd be prorated if we got over 5% between 5% and 25% of a $125 million grant this year. So it'll be a little bit larger. And, you know, if we got just the barely 5%, we'd get about a fifth of that, which would be about $25 million, which would be more than we spent, you know, in all the presidential campaigns combined, probably. So it'd be significant, but it doesn't look like it's in the cards from the polls. The other question I want to answer briefly, Anthony Al said, when can we have the Ukraine discussion with Jill Stein and the U.S. Greens? That's a great question. It's not off topic. The National Committee has a discussion that's been ongoing, but it's not open to all the Greens. And because we haven't had that forum, a number of us have started a new publication called New Green Horizons, where we can talk these things through. There's the link to it. It just began publishing this last week. So go there, see what we published. That's a place where, you know, every party should have a discussion bulletin. We haven't had one accessible to the grassroots of the Green Party movement. So that's what this is for. That's where we can talk about Ukraine and other questions. And there's a comments section. We're going to moderate it so the comments are civil and constructive, and it doesn't become a snarky, you know, back and forth like too often happens on Facebook and Twitter. So that's why we'll moderate it. But so this is where we hope to have a discussion that, you know, all the Greens can speak up without being vilified for having a different position than others. So check that out. I think, Anthony, that's where one place where we can have this discussion. I did debate Jill Stein on Ukraine in January 2023. And you can find that. It's probably on my website, howiehawkins.us. It's elsewhere on YouTube. And you can go back and look at that and see, you know, how what we said back then stands up today. But other than that, I don't, you know, she really hasn't had to deal with a position except like the Mehdi Hassan interview, which was mentioned. Mehdi pushed on some questions, and the follow-up question she hasn't had to deal with. And unfortunately, the treatment of her position has been, you know, the Democrats kind of distorting it a little bit to make it worse. And then she kind of defends the position, which makes it worse for the Greens, as I think you're implying, Anthony. So anyway, I didn't want to let those go by without comment. So next week I will be here in Kyiv. I don't know who I have as a guest, but I will have somebody from this part of the world because as Pavlo pointed out, you know, American exceptionalism, the left has it, the so-called anti-imperialist left has it because it's a parochialism. It's like, you know, and you see this in the Green discussion about the European Greens. It's like, we know better than them. We haven't even talked to them. And that's why we need to hear from people and have a real dialogue. So that's next week, same time, same place, unless the air raid has us, you know, underground where we can't get to the internet, or there's a power outage or something like that. But hopefully that won't happen, and we'll be here. If not, Chris, who's in the background, may play some interviews I've done with people over here as soon as we can figure out how to work it through Dropbox. I've been having trouble, but some of these young nerds or geeks can help me out. So anyway, thanks for coming on, Alex and Pavlo and Dennis. And until next week, everybody have a good week. And the election's going to happen. So I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about next week, too. All right. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.